I refused to sign a single HOA document. 6 weeks later, my forged signature was on every page. If you love watching entitled HOA officials get caught in crimes they never thought anyone would find, subscribe now. This one ends in real felony charges. I refused to sign a single document for that HOA, not one. And yet, 6 weeks later, I was holding a stack of paperwork bearing my signature on every single page, approving changes I'd never agreed to in my life. My handwriting, my initials, my name, forged so precisely that even I had to look twice to convince myself I hadn't actually signed it. If you love watching entitled HOA officials get exposed for crimes they never thought anyone would catch, subscribe now, because this story ends with someone facing actual felony charges over a forged signature. I'd moved into that neighborhood specifically because it advertised itself as low restriction, low fee, minimal HOA involvement. That's exactly what drew me in after years of dealing with more aggressive associations elsewhere. The paperwork during closing had been simple, straightforward, nothing alarming. 6 months after moving in, that changed entirely. A new HOA board took over, led by a woman named Sandra Kowalski, who arrived with an entirely different vision for the neighborhood than what had existed when I bought my home. Within her first 2 months, she began pushing for what she called modernization initiatives, expanded landscaping requirements, mandatory exterior paint approval processes, and a significant increase in monthly dues to fund what she described as necessary community improvements. I wasn't opposed to reasonable changes. I was opposed to being told my input didn't matter. At the community meeting where these changes were first proposed, I raised concerns about the dues increase, specifically questioning why residents hadn't been given adequate time to review the full financial breakdown before voting. Sandra brushed off my questions with practiced ease, insisting the changes were already essentially finalized and merely required standard resident acknowledgment paperwork. That phrase, standard resident acknowledgement paperwork, should have concerned me more than it initially did. A week later, I received a packet in the mail requiring my signature, formally acknowledging and consenting to the new covenant changes, including the increased dues structure. I read through it carefully, disagreed with several provisions, and made a deliberate decision. I didn't sign it. Instead, I mailed back a formal letter stating clearly that I did not consent to the proposed changes as written and requesting additional documentation before considering any agreement. I kept a copy of that letter, along with proof of mailing, specifically because something about Sandra's rushed approach had made me cautious enough to protect myself. Weeks passed without any response. I assumed reasonably that my objection had simply been noted and that the matter would eventually work through whatever formal process the HOA's bylaws required for handling resident disagreement. Then, nearly 6 weeks later, I received something that made absolutely no sense. A community-wide newsletter celebrating what Sandra described as unanimous resident approval of the new covenant changes, thanking every homeowner by name for their cooperation and support during this exciting transition period. My name was listed among those who'd approved. I sat there staring at that newsletter, feeling something cold settle into my stomach. I hadn't approved anything. I'd specifically, deliberately, in writing, refused to sign. I called the HOA's management office directly, requesting to see my actual signed acknowledgement form, assuming there had simply been some kind of clerical mistake, my objection letter perhaps misfiled or overlooked entirely. The woman on the phone pulled up my file and confirmed, with obvious confusion in her voice, that my signed acknowledgement form was indeed on file, dated 3 weeks earlier. "That's not possible," I said. "I never signed that form." I sent back a written objection instead. There was a pause. "I'm showing a signed and dated form here, ma'am. Would you like me to email you a copy for your records?" 10 minutes later, an email arrived with a scanned copy of the exact document I supposedly signed. I stared at my own signature on that page, my hands trembling slightly as I compared it to years of documents I genuinely signed myself. It looked almost exactly like mine. Almost perfect. Close enough that anyone glancing at it casually would never have questioned its authenticity. But it wasn't mine. I knew my own signature better than anyone, and something about the pressure, the exact curve of certain letters, felt subtly, unmistakably wrong. Someone had forged my signature on a legally binding HOA document, and I was about to find out exactly how far they were willing to go to make sure nobody ever noticed. I sat at my kitchen table staring at that scanned signature for nearly an hour, comparing it obsessively against old documents, bank forms, anything I could find with my genuine handwriting. The more I looked, the more certain I became. This wasn't my signature. It was a forgery good enough to fool a casual glance, but not good enough to fool the person whose name had actually been stolen. I called Marcus, an attorney I'd worked with years earlier during an unrelated property matter, someone I trusted enough to bring something this serious to immediately. "Send me everything," he said after I explained the situation. "The original objection letter you sent, proof of mailing, the newsletter claiming approval, and that scanned signature. Don't contact the HOA again until I've reviewed everything properly." I gathered every piece of documentation that same evening, forwarding copies to Marcus along with a detailed timeline of exactly what had happened, from my initial written objection to the confusing phone call confirming a signature I'd never provided. Marcus called back the next morning, his tone noticeably more serious than our initial conversation. "This is potentially forgery, fraud, and possibly identity theft, depending on how it was executed," he said. "But before we escalate this, I want to understand the full scope. Has anyone else in the neighborhood mentioned similar issues?" I hadn't thought to ask, honestly too focused on my own situation to consider whether this might extend beyond just me. I started reaching out quietly to a few neighbors I trusted, carefully framing my questions without immediately revealing the full extent of what I discovered. The first neighbor I spoke with, an older man named Harold who'd lived there for nearly a decade, seemed confused by my question at first. "I definitely didn't sign anything," he said. "I actually meant to attend that follow-up meeting to ask more questions, but it got rescheduled at the last minute, and I completely forgot about it afterward. Did you get a newsletter listing you as having approved the changes?" There was a pause. "Actually, yes. I remember being surprised, thinking maybe my wife had signed something without mentioning it to me. I never actually followed up to check. My stomach tightened further. This wasn't isolated to just my situation. I spoke with 3 more neighbors that same week, and the pattern repeated with unsettling consistency. 2 of them, similar to Harold, had simply assumed a family member had handled the paperwork, never bothering to verify the signature themselves. One neighbor, a young woman named Diane, remembered explicitly refusing to sign during a phone conversation with Sandra directly, yet her name also appeared on the approval list. I brought this expanded pattern back to Marcus, watching his expression shift from serious to genuinely alarmed as I laid out each conversation. "This isn't a single forged signature anymore," he said. "If multiple residents are reporting the same experience, we're potentially looking at a systematic pattern of fraud, not an isolated mistake. What do we do now?" "We need actual signature analysis," Marcus said. "A forensic document examiner can compare your genuine signature against the forged one, providing expert testimony regarding authenticity. If we can establish clear forgery on even a handful of these documents, that becomes powerful evidence for a much larger investigation." I hired a forensic document examiner recommended by Marcus, someone experienced specifically in signature authentication for legal disputes. She reviewed my genuine signature samples alongside the forged HOA document, along with samples from Harold and Diane once they agreed to participate in the growing investigation. Her report arrived 2 weeks later, and the findings were unambiguous. All 3 signatures, mine, Harold's, and Diane's, showed clear indicators of forgery. Subtle inconsistencies in pen pressure, stroke formation, and natural signature variation that wouldn't exist if we'd actually signed the documents ourselves. According to her professional analysis, whoever had forged these signatures had clearly practiced closely from existing samples, likely obtained from previous HOA correspondence or documentation already on file, but hadn't perfected the subtle inconsistencies that occur naturally in genuine handwriting. Marcus filed a formal complaint with the county district attorney's office that same week, attaching the forensic examiner's report, along with sworn statements from myself, Harold, and Diane confirming we'd never signed the documents in question. Within days, an investigator from the county's fraud division contacted me directly, requesting a formal interview to discuss the full scope of what appeared to be a coordinated forgery scheme, potentially involving numerous residents throughout the entire neighborhood. I sat across from that investigator 2 days later, walking through everything I discovered, watching her expression grow increasingly serious with each new detail I provided. Based on what you're describing, she said, closing her notebook after nearly 2 hours, this sounds like it could extend significantly beyond the 3 residents you've identified so far. How much further? She hesitated slightly before answering. That depends on how many other residents assumed a family member handled paperwork they never personally verified, exactly like your neighbor Harold did. I felt a chill settle over me as the true scope of what might actually be happening finally started to sink in. The investigator's words stayed with me long after she left that day. How many other residents had simply assumed someone else handled their paperwork, never bothering to check a signature they had no reason to doubt. The county's fraud investigation expanded quickly once formal charges seemed likely. Investigators requested access to every signed acknowledgment form the HOA had on file, cross-referencing them against genuine handwriting samples pulled from mortgage documents, tax records, and any other legitimately signed paperwork residents had filed with the county over the years. 2 weeks into that expanded investigation, the forensic document examiner working with the county's fraud division delivered preliminary findings that made my earlier discovery look almost minor by comparison. Out of 147 households in the neighborhood, 63 signed acknowledgment forms showed clear indicators of forgery. 63. Nearly half the entire community. I sat in stunned silence when Marcus called to share that number, trying to process the sheer scale of what Sandra had apparently orchestrated. This wasn't someone panicking over a handful of resistant residents. This was a calculated, methodical scheme designed to push through covenant changes and dues increases regardless of actual community consent, forging whatever signatures were necessary to create the appearance of unanimous approval. How does someone even do this at that scale without getting caught immediately? I asked. Access and opportunity, Marcus said. As HOA president, Sandra had legitimate access to every resident's previous correspondence, meeting sign-in sheets, even old covenant acknowledgement forms from years prior. All she needed was an existing signature sample to practice from, and enough confidence that residents wouldn't bother double-checking documents they assumed were routine. The investigation also revealed something else deeply troubling. Sandra hadn't acted entirely alone. The management company handling the HOA's administrative paperwork had processed and filed every forged document without any apparent verification process, raising serious questions about whether their staff had simply been negligent or potentially complicit in allowing the scheme to continue unnoticed. As word of the investigation spread through the neighborhood, residents who'd previously had no idea their own signatures might be compromised began contacting the county directly, requesting copies of their own acknowledgement forms to check for themselves. The community reaction was intense. An emergency meeting was called, though this time, unlike Sandra's previous meetings, it was organized independently by concerned residents rather than the HOA board itself, specifically to discuss the growing scandal and coordinate next steps for those affected. I attended that meeting alongside Harold, Diane, and dozens of other residents who'd discovered their own forged signatures over the preceding weeks. The energy in that room felt entirely different from any previous HOA gathering, charged with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and growing determination to hold Sandra fully accountable. She's been running this neighborhood like her own personal kingdom, one resident said, standing near the back of the crowded room. I trusted the paperwork because I trusted the process. I never imagined I'd need to verify my own signature against documents for my own HOA. Another resident, someone who'd apparently tried raising concerns about Sandra's leadership style months before any of this surfaced, stood up next. I actually questioned some of her decisions early on, and she made it very clear very quickly that dissent wasn't welcome. I backed off because I didn't want to deal with the headache of fighting her directly. I wonder now if that's exactly why she felt confident enough to do this. That comment settled uncomfortably in my chest. How many residents had backed down from questioning Sandra specifically because her aggressive, confident leadership style discouraged genuine scrutiny? How much easier had that made it for her to forge documents, trusting that most people simply wouldn't bother verifying details they assumed were routine? 2 days after that community meeting, Sandra herself finally responded publicly, sending a defensive email to the entire neighborhood, claiming the forgery allegations were wildly exaggerated and insisting any discrepancies were simply the result of an overwhelmed administrative process during a particularly busy transition period. Nobody believed her. Not after 63 confirmed forged signatures. Not after forensic analysis had already established clear, deliberate patterns of forgery across dozens of separate documents. 3 days after that email, county investigators arrived at Sandra's home, directly executing a search warrant that had been approved based on the overwhelming evidence already compiled against her. What they found inside that house would make the 63 forged signatures look like just the beginning. The search warrant executed at Sandra's home turned up something far more organized and calculated than anyone had anticipated. Investigators found an entire filing system meticulously maintained, containing practice sheets, genuine signature samples pulled from old HOA correspondence, and drafts showing multiple attempts at replicating specific residents' handwriting before achieving what she apparently considered an acceptable forgery. This wasn't panic-driven or impulsive. This was methodical, practiced, and disturbingly deliberate. Marcus called me the evening the warrant results became available to the case file. They found something else, he said. Something bigger than the forgery itself. Bigger how? Financial records, he said. I can't share everything yet, but the investigators specifically asked me whether the increased dues Sandra pushed through actually matched what residents were told the money would be used for. I sat with that question for a long moment. The community improvements, the landscaping upgrades, the modernization initiatives Sandra had promised during that very first meeting where I'd raised concerns nobody wanted to hear. Marcus, I said slowly, are you telling me the money didn't go where she said it would? He didn't answer directly, which told me almost everything I needed to know. 2 days later, the county investigator called to schedule another interview, this time specifically focused on financial questions rather than the forgery itself. She asked detailed questions about the community fund, the landscaping contract Sandra had approved, and whether any resident had ever actually seen completed work matching the amount of money supposedly spent. I realized, sitting there answering her questions, that I genuinely couldn't recall a single major improvement project actually completed since the dues increase went into effect. New landscaping had been promised. I'd seen exactly none of it. We're going to need financial records from the HOA's management company, the investigator said, closing her notebook. Based on what several residents have described, there appears to be a significant discrepancy between funds collected and funds actually spent on stated community projects. I drove home that afternoon, replaying months of community newsletters in my mind, each one celebrating progress on improvements that, now that I actually thought carefully about it, had never physically materialized anywhere in our neighborhood. 3 days later, Marcus called again, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard from him throughout this entire case. They found the account, he said, a private business account registered under a name that traces directly back to Sandra. Nearly 30% of every dollar collected from that dues increase went straight into it. I stood frozen in my kitchen, feeling the full scope of what this actually meant finally settle into place. Sandra hadn't just forged 63 signatures to push through unwanted changes. She'd forged an entire community's consent specifically to justify stealing from her own neighbors, using the increased fees as cover for straightforward embezzlement hidden behind promises of improvements she'd apparently never had any real intention of completing. The scope of charges filed against Sandra reflected the severity of everything investigators had uncovered: 63 counts of forgery, 1 count of embezzlement, and additional charges related to fraud committed against a homeowners association, each carrying significant potential prison time given the calculated, extensive nature of the entire scheme. Marcus walked me through the financial details once the full account records became part of the official case file. Over 6 months, Sandra had collected nearly $200,000 in increased dues from residents across the neighborhood. Of that amount, just over $58,000 had been quietly diverted into her private account, funneled through invoices for landscaping work that inspectors later confirmed had never actually been performed. Fake invoices, fake vendors, an entire paper trail specifically constructed to make embezzlement look like legitimate community spending, backed by the same forged signatures that had originally pushed the dues increase through without genuine resident consent. The community-organized meeting that followed this revelation felt entirely different from anything that had come before. Residents who'd spent months quietly frustrated, some who'd nearly given up questioning Sandra's leadership entirely, now sat together absorbing the full truth of exactly what she'd been doing behind closed doors. Harold, sitting beside me during that meeting, shook his head slowly. I actually felt guilty for a while, wondering if I'd simply forgotten agreeing to something. She made all of us doubt ourselves instead of doubting her. That comment struck me as perhaps the most damaging part of the entire scheme. Sandra hadn't just stolen money and forged documents. She'd manipulated an entire community into distrusting their own memory and judgment, specifically because the alternative, believing their trusted HOA president had deliberately deceived them, felt too outlandish to consider seriously until undeniable evidence forced the truth into the open. The case against Sandra moved through the county court system over the following months, with the sheer volume of evidence, forensic signature analysis, fabricated invoices, financial records, and dozens of resident testimonies making a strong prosecution case increasingly difficult for her defense to counter effectively. I attended the sentencing hearing months later, sitting alongside Harold, Diane, and several other residents who'd become unlikely allies throughout this entire ordeal. Sandra sat at the defense table, noticeably diminished from the confident, commanding presence she'd carried during those early community meetings where she dismissed my concerns with practiced ease. The judge's sentencing reflected the calculated severity of what she'd done. Multiple years of prison time, full restitution required for every dollar embezzled from the community fund, and a permanent prohibition from ever holding any HOA leadership position again anywhere in the state. As Sandra was led out of that courtroom, I felt something I hadn't fully expected. Not triumph, exactly, though there was certainly satisfaction in watching real accountability finally arrive. Mostly, I felt a quiet, sobering understanding of just how easily an entire community's trust could be exploited by someone confident enough, calculated enough, and patient enough to forge her way toward whatever she wanted. The neighborhood elected an entirely new HOA board within 2 months, implementing sweeping transparency reforms specifically designed to prevent anything like this from happening again. Every signed document now required notarization. Financial records became fully public and independently audited each quarter. Every vendor invoice required photographic proof of completed work before payment release. And perhaps most importantly, any resident objection or refusal to sign now required formal documented acknowledgment from at least 2 separate board members, ensuring no single person could ever again quietly bury a resident's genuine dissent. I think about that original refusal often, that simple written objection I mailed back instead of signing paperwork I disagreed with. If I'd simply assumed the matter had been handled properly the way Harold initially had, I might never have discovered the forgery at all, and $58,000 of stolen community money might still be sitting quietly in a private account nobody had ever thought to question. Sometimes the smallest act of insisting on the truth, refusing to sign something you don't actually agree with, becomes the exact thread that unravels an entire scheme someone else was counting on nobody ever pulling. If this story hit you the way it hit me telling it, make sure you're subscribed, because the next HOA story I bring you might expose something even more shocking than forged signatures and stolen dues.